And I'm here to chair the panel that we have to discuss the issue of profit as a dirty word. The panel, a very distinguished panel, consists of, on the far side, Susan Rice, who for many years was one of the most eminent bankers in Scotland and is now, among many things, chair of the Scottish Development and Investment, whatever it is, SDCI. Getting the work in, you know what I mean. So Susan, obviously a very knowledgeable banker. In the middle we have Simon Walker, who is the Director General of the Institute of Directors, been in many businesses over the years, in British Airways, Reuters, the Palace, for that matter, and indeed in Downing Street earlier in his career. And closest to me, we have Francis O'Grady, who is the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress and has been with the TUC for a little over 20 years, working her way up and through the organization. So a very distinguished and interesting panel, I think, to discuss this issue. Now, how I want to play it is I have 3 questions to jerk you into wakefulness at periodic points, which will be a cue for the different sections of the discussion. And I'll put one up in a moment. But before we do that, I just really wanted to say that I think this issue of profit being a dirty word or not, as it says in the program, is vital, because clearly profitable businesses are necessary for profitable investment, and profitable investment is indeed the core of the entire pensions fund or indeed investment industry. And without profitable companies, profitable investments, then the pension fund model doesn't work, and there isn't a solution to the problems of old age and prosperity in retirement, which the nation needs. So it is indeed important that businesses continue to make profits, and indeed that it is socially acceptable that they make profits, and indeed endorsed and encouraged by the population at large that they make profits. But the issue, essentially, I think, about profits and whether it's a dirty word, it comes down to issues of trust in business. And obviously, opinion polls say that half the population now does not trust big business. I think they still trust small businesses, you know, their local garage or their local high street or whatever. But when it comes to big business, then there is a definite distrust. And I think there are two kinds of trust, in a way. I think there's the what I call intellectual trust, which, if you like, is that the customer, say in financial services, when they put their money in a bank, expects that money to be safe. They don't expect the chief executive to disappear with it or the bank to go bust. So there is a trust in the organization as such, which does exist, even after the turmoil of recent years. But there's a second kind of trust, an emotional trust, and that is, do I trust this organization to give me a fair deal? And that, I think, is where finance has a major problem with its customers, that most of them do not think they are getting a fair deal. It may be the only deal on offer, but there is this element of mistrust there. And so this sort of feeds into the issue of profits as being a dirty word, in the sense that it's not that profits as such are necessarily a dirty word, but that the public somehow feels the profits are being made at their expense, that again, they're not getting this fair deal, and that they are somehow being exploited to deliver these profits, and therefore they don't necessarily think that is a good thing or a thing to be encouraged. So there are also many complex issues here. So the panel will, over the next hour or so, kick these around much better than I can. But may I start with the first question that I'd like you to vote on, if the men in the back room can put it up. And this is just one as a cue to get the discussion underway. If you could vote on this as to, do you agree that the root cause of distrust is, and profit being a dirty word, is the excessive pay of executives rather than excess profit. So if you can do an agree, disagree, or don't know, my word. Oh, you weren't meant to do that. That is fascinating that 84% of you on the first cut would think that it is excessive executive pay rather than excessive profit, which is the core issue. Well, taking that as a cue, can I go to you, Simon, first? Not just necessarily to comment on that, but in the wider context of, do you think that profit's a dirty word? And if so, why? And has it always been thus, or has it got a lot worse in recent times?
Look, profit shouldn't be a dirty word because profit has to be at the cornerstone of our economy and of economic growth. But it can't be obsessiveness about profit. It can't be profit at any cost and at any price to the community, to the customer, and to society as a whole. But actually, it really is important. I mean, we're going into a general election where all the political parties, all the major parties, are committed to restraining public spending. Tax, the proceeds of companies' profitability, is going to be more important than ever. So profit is really going to matter because that's where all the money that pays for health, education, and everything else that government ends up providing actually comes from. Profit's not everything. There's ample scope for non-profit businesses, for social enterprises, for other forms of operation, including companies that are owned by their employees and that distribute their profits to them. So profit is not everything, but actually it's the cornerstone, it's the fundamental, it's the driver, and it matters.
It's a bit disingenuous, though, Simon, to say that profit is necessary to pay for all these services, because the actual corporation tax profit has declined really quite dramatically over the last decade or so.
Yes, that's true, but the exchequer take that comes out of the private sector and out of private sector business as a whole, which includes an awful lot of other things. It includes national insurance, so-called national insurance contributions, which are effectively a payroll tax or simply income tax, and actually the income tax that's paid by the people who work for these businesses is vital to society as a whole. I mean, there are a lot of problems with corporation tax. It is probably the worst tax that governments have at their disposal. It's a very incompetent tax, especially in a globalized situation. But actually, without the private sector's contribution, there is nothing, because government doesn't generate by itself.
Francis O'Grady, can I bring you in here? Basically, that first question of whether, what are the origins of this distrust? Is it worse than it has been in the past? And, well, generally, what's your reaction to it?
Look, I think trade unionists and working people more than anybody understand the need for successful companies that turn a profit, that invest, that deliver livelihoods and jobs. I think the problem comes, and I would draw a distinction between profits and profiteering. And I think people look at it begs the question, what's unfair then? What's unfair in terms of profits? And I think if you look at, for example, the rail industry, where we were sold privatisation on the basis that it would generate more investment and a better deal for passengers. And people feel, quite rightly in my view, that actually it turns out that the taxpayer is providing the lion's share of investment, and that companies are doing quite nicely and passengers are getting stung. You can look at a whole range of companies where people feel very, very strongly about tax avoidance and tax evasion. And we've seen that very graphically in respect of some of that cash stashed away in Switzerland, where people feel strongly about that. I think this issue of executive pay is absolutely key. And again, no surprise when since 2010 we've seen pay at the top soar by 26%, and pay for ordinary workers, on average, cut in real terms by over 8%. And people don't understand, given any good leader should recognise that workers are wealth creators too, why that gap should be opening up. But I don't think it's the whole story, and maybe we'll come on to this later, but I think there's a bigger concern about the stewardship of our companies, the way in which top directors' pay packages are sometimes structured in respect of delivering the short-term bucks, the primacy of shareholders above each and every other stakeholder in a company, a whole range of issues that for us raise big questions about not profits, but whether there are fair profits, who's getting them, how they're raised, and where they end up, and what the balance between benefits for shareholders, workers, and indeed the customer and consumer and taxpayer are, how those are shared.
But again, aren't you being slightly disingenuous in the sense that the public at large totally overestimate the amount of profit? And you could almost wipe out profits and it would not transform the wage bills of the employees. But there is a kind of, as it were, union view that all we have to do, that all profits are being made at the expense of the employees. And this tends, I think, to encourage a distrust, doesn't it?
We clearly have an interest in profits being used for long-term investment, for the long-term good of a company. But I think the facts are, and the evidence is very clear, that the overall share of wealth that is produced in this country has changed dramatically. So in the 60s and 70s, over 60% of the total wealth that we produced went into wage packets. Now it's less than a half. And people are asking quite rightly whether not just growing pay inequality between the top and the rest is the problem, but actually that real shift in balance of the total share going to wages, not just because it's about fairness, but because this is one of the reasons why we're seeing an absence of demand in the economy, and why, of course, we've got a big black hole in returns to the exchequer, because wages growth for most people has not grown as fast as people expected. So it's leaving the taxpayer short too.
I think there are lots of issues there. I should say, by the way, if you want any of you to ask any questions, you can email them to me on my iPad here, and I'll put them to the audience. You don't have to stand up and have a microphone, unless you particularly want to. Can I bring you in, Susan? I mean, you've been a banker long enough to remember when they used to make profits. So what's your take on this?
They're starting again, which is actually a good thing. I think profit was never meant to be a dirty word. It's people who make it that. Profit itself, if you go back and look at the word itself, derives from progress, derives from the sense of to advance. These are basic human characteristics. If you look at how it's defined, it's about gain, usefulness, good, and yet it carries this connotation which relates to envy, to a sense of, they've got something and I don't. I think we as human beings are the ones who give it the cast that we do. I have a lot of board experience across 3 sectors, public, private, and not-for-profit. Not-for-profits make profit. If they don't, they're out of business. It's just they use the profit differently. And so we shouldn't assume that a little so-called not-for-profit or charity is a better place to work in a moral sense. Their job is to make it work financially as well. When I say it's people that affect this, it is and it's very much really, Francis, I think what you're saying, it's how that profit is used. That is the most important thing. It's the use to which it's put. And that's up to us to address that and to do something about it. And so it's everything that Simon is saying in terms of the programs and the exchequer and so on. And so it should be. in companies which lose that aspect of making profit, I think they've lost their way genuinely. And I think that, you know, that is a wrong. That is a social and a moral wrong if they don't think about the use to which the profits are being put. And to be a little bit controversial, I've chaired the remuneration committee of a FTSE 30 company for 7 years. And so I talk a lot and have talked a lot to investors. And I find different views amongst investors. Many do say, well, as long as you made profits last quarter, you know, that's fine. That's what we want. And some investors are themselves remunerated on that quarterly basis. And so I think we all, those of us in business, those of us who are managing funds and managing investments, have an obligation to take that longer term view and to say it's about more than this past quarter's profits. I think we as people have to address this issue.
I mean, France has mentioned the 70s when, as with the Labour share was much higher than it is now, and indeed at a cyclical peak. But do you feel that this issue of profit is worse now than it has been? There's a question again for you to start off with.
Meaning who gets it, in a sense? Yeah.
I mean, memories are so short. Is it actually much worse now than it was, say, in the 1970s or 1980s or the 1990s?
Difficult for me to say in the context because I wasn't living in the UK then. So, right. I mean, it's who gets the money, but also what are the standards of living, because it may be that a lot is provided sort of generally by government and by other services, which has actually raised standards of living. I think that I go back again to individuals. I think people need and want sort of access to the ability to earn something themselves and to grow and to improve what they're doing. And you know, I don't know if the balance has changed that much. I mean, to be very direct, I don't know the answer to your question, but I think if overall there is the possibility or a sense of opportunity and a possibility of aspiration, that is hugely important, and that is what makes society move on and it keeps it going. And a lot of that comes because businesses and companies are profitable. If you think about it the other way, if profit was to be capped in some way, or you know, you couldn't have so much profit, life isn't a zero-sum game. You know, money doesn't get printed just for the fun of it. And where does the support then come to provide the services and the other things that are needed, and the jobs above all? I think work is something that human beings require. I mean, it's a kind of innate, almost a genetic thing that you need, and the jobs come from companies that are making profit as well. So I haven't answered your question, but that's because I don't know the answer.
I mean, well, Francis, do you think it's worse now than it has been in the past, the public attitude to profitability?
Well,
or profit?
It's measurably worse in terms of what happens to those profits. As I say, I think much of this has been at the expense of ordinary workers' pay. And Britain does have this long-running problem of low investment, low productivity, and now growing inequality, which, you know, as I say, is not just an ethical question. Actually, many economists now agree that it was that growing inequality that was a key factor leading to the crash. And we're already seeing worrying signs now because wages and living standards have not recovered to the extent that perhaps George Osborne would like us to believe, of growing household debt, which was one of the conditions that got us into the mess in the first place. So I think it really does matter. It has shifted against certainly the interests of working people who, in my view, have the biggest interest in the long-term success of a company. But I don't think it will get fixed voluntarily alone. I think we have now got a problem with our corporate governance system whereby it's just not fit for purpose. The nature of shareholding of companies in Britain has changed dramatically. The majority of shares are held overseas. An awful lot of them change hands very quickly. Share trading has gone up. The institutional investors tend to spread their bets. That kind of intimate relationship between shareholders and the success of a company has been broken. And so I think corporate governance needs reform, and I'm keen that working people should have a role in that and a place in that conversation as much as other stakeholders.
I'm thinking in a second, Simon, even Karl Marx said that high profits were necessary for investment, and that low profits don't feed investment. But we won't go there at the moment.
Well,
Simon.
Look, I agree with Francis that low investment, low productivity are real problems. I'm not at all sure about inequality. The fact is, the time that inequality in this country was at its least, when the Gini coefficient was at its lowest, was in the late 1970s, when this country was a complete economic basket case, when it was actually at its worst. Now, we've got a lot of problems from inequality, but they're fundamentally, in my view, the result of globalization. What we have to come back to about profitability, and that's perfectly reasonable because there's a lot of greed out there, and I'd agree with the trade union movement about that. There is excess pay in the top ranks of British businesses, and it leads to that kind of perception. But why profitability is necessary is to pay dividends to pension funds and to the pensioners of this country, and indeed of other countries. I have no problem with that. And that's why boards need to be far more aggressive in the way they actively run, actively sort of pursue the executive management of the companies that they're talking about. And actually, fund managers are particularly important in that. And this goes to something Susan said, which is this quarterly cycle. If you've got people who are remunerated on a quarterly basis, saying, well, how are these companies doing this quarter? That's our concern. How can you possibly have a long-term view of a company's future? And that long-term stewardship is absolutely fundamental to running companies. And it's now part of the corporate code. You can't run a company just on the basis of the next 3 months. And I applaud it when an AstraZeneca says, we're going to reject this bid by Pfizer, which will bring us good short-term return and be great for the shareholders in the short term, because we believe in the long term we can do much better. And in a way, actually, that is good corporate governance, and it shows, actually, in my view, that the system is working. It may not be right, I hope it is right, it may not be, but it actually shows the decisions are being made on a long-term view in the interests of the people who ultimately benefit from the company. But I actually think fund managers have a big role to play. They're not playing it properly at the moment. They're not nearly as activist as they ought to be. And I think part of the problem is their remuneration is pretty much like what's given rise to that. And that's something that I think the fund management industry ought to be focusing on as well.
Yes, Susan.
Yeah, it's sort of 2 points. One of them around that corporate governance challenge. I think we do need to keep in mind, and I've seen this study, I assume it's legitimate research, that the huge explosion in remuneration for the top executives in our biggest companies absolutely parallels and really starts and kicks off at the time when transparency and public display of those packages started. So you have a lot of highly competitive people running businesses, and it's in their nature to be very competitive, and all of a sudden they see what someone else is earning. And I mean, I've heard some of these conversations directly. Well, he's got that, I want to get that, and so on and so forth. And so sometimes I would just say about corporate governance, it's not always a great idea to have government or others work out how to fix it. I'm not saying, you're not saying that, but I think you need to watch out what you wish for when you go for a good such as transparency and it has an unexpected consequence. So that's one thing. The other thing, and this is in defense of fund managers, there are places and aspects where that longer term view is being taken. I do a lot of work in the environmental area, so I have a lot of focus there. And I know fund managers, and a number of you may even be here, I don't know, who've looked at how do you look at how do you measure a company today on its long-term carbon reduction prospects, because there's a law that says companies all have to reduce carbon. And some are spending money today, and therefore their profits are a little lower because they're spending, but they'll reach their legal requirement when the time comes. Others aren't spending a penny, to put it in an extreme view, and that means that they're building up a huge expense. They might look quite profitable today, but they're building up a huge expense for tomorrow because they still have to spend that money. So you can take an industry, the airline industry, and you can put all the airlines on the bottom of a graph and you'll see who's halfway to their goal and who is not. And it's a multi-year goal, 6-8 years, whatever it is. And fund managers that I know are looking at this, and it's actually monetizing carbon risk today. And they're beginning to see how you look at that forward measurement, and then make a judgment today about whether or not to invest in that company. Is that really a good company for tomorrow? And so I would just love to see more creativity amongst fund managers in other areas like that. I think that's first-class work.
I mean, Francis mentioned earlier that governance was not working as it should. You mentioned engagement, Simon. I've heard a lot of people say that, apropos the pay issue, that what it shows is that the public company model is no longer working because it is the ownerless corporation, that the shareholders or the fund managers, who are the representatives of the owners, don't exercise the restraint or the challenge to management that they should, and that they're not going to. Therefore, we do need to move towards different kinds of ownership models. How do you feel about that? I know your members tend to be smaller,
yeah.
but...
I recognise the problem, and it is a big problem, but I think it's like democracy. It's a lousy system, except for all the others that have ever been tried. I think the corporate model tries to get it right. It doesn't always work, and at the moment, there is a need to say to an awful lot of highly paid executives in big companies, look, you're paying yourselves much too much. It's not linked to performance, and it's not long-term enough in its outlook, which is why you need clawback provisions that go over some years. And I'm not talking necessarily about superstars. I don't think it much matters that a Martin Sorrell who's created a company like WPP out of nothing is paid a ridiculous amount of money. I don't think that's the problem. I think it's the situation where incentive packages end up doing serious damage to companies. Cable and Wireless Worldwide is a very good example of a company that was ultimately destroyed because the incentive system involved incentivized heavily very short-term profits, wrecked investment in the medium and long term. And my question is, where the hell were the shareholders when all this was happening? What were they saying? What pressure were they putting? I agree, where were the directors? That's the non-execs, that's a good question too. But what were the shareholders saying to the directors? Were fund managers putting pressure on directors and saying, look, this company is going to be destroyed if it doesn't invest, if it doesn't look to the medium and long term? And that's what I think people need to be asking themselves, because if they were putting pressure on, asking the questions that they ought to be, I think the system would work.
But isn't the problem that the shareholders are agents too? I mean, it's not the fund managers' money. Exactly. And the fund managers make their bonuses not by messing around doing the job properly, in an engagement sense, and they're not going to.
There needs to be a medium-term view. That responsibility needs to be built, and it is built into corporate governance, actually. There's not, in my view, adequate accountability for it, not adequate clawback. There's far too much focus on making sure that wicked executives don't have their hands in the till, and not nearly enough on, is the judgment right? Is it appropriately cautious and long-term? Have these overweening, dominant chief executives been questioned, been probed adequately by non-execs on the board and by the ultimate owners of the company? That's the point I'd make. And I think that's not happening enough, and it ought to be.
Francis?
I mean, I think probably would all agree in terms of some of our analysis of the problems, but the problem is I've been listening to this for a very, very long time, and it sometimes feels a little removed from the degree of public concern and sometimes anger that there is. And it also feels, I have to say, very old-fashioned, the notion that there are lots of excuses as to why workers whose livelihoods depend on the success of a company shouldn't have a say, not a veto, but a say in how the company is run. The majority of EU member states now provide for some kind of representation of workers on the board. Why are British workers so different to French, Italian or Germans? And actually, it's not just about voice. It's because we know, again, the evidence is there, surveys of company chairs across Europe, that workers can make a good contribution and improve the quality of decision making. And sometimes, when it comes to issues like top pay, just introduce a bit of common sense. But I would have thought any good leadership would want to have the maximum possible engagement of the workers who are ultimately responsible for delivering that company's success. And it seems very strange to me that short-term shareholders who are just trying to make money from trading shares and then out the door, you know, a month later should have a say when the workforce whose jobs and community depend on that success are silenced.
Do you think that attitudes to profit would be improved if there were workers on the board?
Oh, well, absolutely. And workers on the board and workers' engagement generally correlates with all sorts of good behaviours we would agree on. That more R&D investment, better pay solidarity, good employment practices, high performance working. It's all documented by the OECD and many others that you know, is one of the outcomes of real engagement rather than a pat on the head.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks, as I listen to you, Francis, to the idea of companies that are partnerships or do profit sharing right across the company, so that if this profit is made, every single person receives a piece of that, you know, every year that there is profit made, every individual who works for that company. And they then engage in that company, in whether it's productivity terms or influencing terms, in a very different way. And it's interesting, you mentioned banks before. Banks used to do that as well. Every single person, down to the most recent, most junior cashier, had a bit of that profit at the end of the year. And I think that's actually, personally think, is a very good thing. Could I also just say something? Simon mentioned the word accountability. I often think, I mean, I guess I'd take that one step further and say responsibility. That one of the things that one of the things that sometimes is missing is, as we get more rules and more requirements and more codes, and you know, companies have to do this, that, and the other, and our shareholders help us make sure that we're following the codes, that there is a lack of responsibility, that you back off and you say, well, fine, we're doing all these things, it must be all right. Actually, every company, and maybe this is where some of what you're saying comes in, has to have people in the company, people who are taking responsibility for the decisions for what that company does. And that goes beyond the accountability or the compliance that is also required.
And as just to your point about workers on the board, I just think that every pension scheme, every DB pension scheme had employee trustees on the board. And it didn't seem to do anything for worker engagement with the pension schemes that I was involved with. They were still, you know, distant, remote, and people tend to be unengaged with them. I just wonder if it would actually make that much difference. Anyway, I still haven't got any questions, by the way, so you're clearly you're clearly either enthralled or asleep. But if anybody does want to ask any questions, do indicate, and I can get a mic to you, or you can do it through the iPad. I think let's have another question up and move things on. The second question, which is, are tax switching and tax avoidance policies justified in order to enhance shareholder value? No. 60%, or not, well, 58% say no, 38% say yes, and a tiny sliver of don't knows. Interesting. I mean, this plays to some of the things we've been saying anyway, but I suppose the issue, I mean, we're saying how this has got worse in recent times. Shareholder value is very much the mantra of the last 20 years, and it has given boards much more focus on, as it were, profit at the expense of other shareholders, or profit, the primacy of profit anyway. And so we have some reaction to it. You've already mentioned a bit how one needs to claw back from this, but I suppose my question, I suppose, to you, probably to you, Simon, to start with, would be that if And actually, the Unilever case is a good example where there's a company where the chief executive has sort of almost said that he is going to pursue other things and profit is not in the medium term. In the short term, profit is not the primary goal. In your view, if Unilever profits slumped, would he survive? I mean, would in fact, are the investors actually going to buy into that?
I think they do, actually.
They do at the moment,
and I don't,
yes,
he's not doing it as a matter of charity, because that would be wrong. That would be giving away other people's money. He's doing it as part of taking a long view of Unilever's future. And actually, I think he's right. He might not be, but I've no doubt that the view is genuine. He believes if he's doing an awful lot of things in Africa, if Unilever's doing a lot of work in Africa, it is developing future markets for products that actually there's no demand for in Africa at the moment, that are quite important for Unilever in established markets in the West. I think that's quite a good bet, actually. But actually, it's a business bet. It's not a sentimental one. It's not a charitable one. And that's where I quarrel with that. I mean, companies have an obligation to obey the law. That is an absolute. But actually, the Companies Act says directors have a duty to promote the long-term success of the company. And that, of course, that includes tax planning. Of course it does. Of course it includes the mitigation of a tax bill, which is just another output, actually, for a company. Now, does it mean incredibly aggressive and abusive tax practices that are going to bring destruction on a company in the end because governments are going to react? No, it doesn't, because that is not in the long or even in this day and age short-term interests of any company. If it's going to bring the house of cards crashing down, it is not a good idea. But companies should not pay tax as a voluntary gesture. I thought it was wrong when Starbucks paid £20 million because it made them feel better. It wasn't actually management's money to give away. It was their shareholders. And if politicians have established foolish rules that allow people to drive a coach and horses through tax arrangements, if politicians have established regimes, subsidies for film production are a very good example of that, brought in by Gordon Brown, which subsequently turned out to be horrendously abused. They can't actually be surprised when these things are taken advantage of. I actually prefer very low taxes and no tax breaks at all. Actually, New Zealand has that. No tax breaks at all and a maximum tax rate of 33% for anything.
But, I mean, given that companies have responsibilities to all their stakeholders, and government, and indeed the society in which they are based, is one of those stakeholders, don't they have a responsibility to pay their reasonable dues to that jurisdiction? The fact that they can step out around it because of some loophole surely is not the issue.
They have the obligation to pay the legal requirement. That is their obligation.
But on that basis, everybody they employ should get the minimum wage and no more. I mean, they have an obligation to pay a minimum wage.
Not at all. You make decisions about skills levels that and rewarding on that basis. But your obligation to the government is to pay your legal dues, and that is an absolute requirement. But it's quite wrong to turn tax into a voluntary system, and it's an incredibly bad idea.
But we started with Unilever, and you were talking about sustainability as being, his central business case. It wasn't philanthropy, it was actually the sensible way to run a business. This actually brings an issue. I mean, is sustainability a way of, as we're marrying these disparate pressures? I mean, you mentioned, Susan, the carbon issue, but I mean, do you think that a greater emphasis on sustainability will somehow weld everything together? Your view, and then Francis.
Sustainability is a word that has 1,000 definitions. So, it's sometimes just environment, sometimes it's much more, sometimes it's a circular economy, which actually has huge appeal to me in various ways. I think sustainability, however you see it, has a potential upside if it works commercially. I think separating these things that becomes then problematic. It's the same thing with so-called corporate responsibility, which is a horrible term. And even though what it does and achieves is a great good sometimes, but when you do it as a separate thing, that's not good. If you conceive of your business as having social implications, so if you take profit on its own, just pure profit, the number, it's like having the hot fudge without the ice cream. You know, it's not all there. You need to know where the profit is going and what it's being used for. And some of it may go into tax and some of it may go into other things. And that's really what could eventually lead to sustainability. So I think, yes, I think if you take that kind of outlook and see the use to which the profit is being made, come up with a reasonable approach to taxes and taxation. And I think Simon is right that you have a legal system about taxes, and that is legislated. Your legislators should then have the courage to legislate a different tax program, or else, you know, not fuss about people who use what is available. So I think there is some potential upside in all of that. But it's not a cure as such. You know, suddenly a sustainable business doesn't suddenly become a right business. I would also say, just as an appendix to what I've just said, that there are other corporate financial practices that we should think about. There are some companies, as a banker, I've known quite a few of these, who have a very conscious approach within their finance department to pay their receivables, to pay their bills, basically, at the last day, 90 days, 91 days, 100 days. And often it's the smaller businesses that are hurt by that kind of thing. But I think it's more than just an approach to tax. I think there's something about responsibility overall in how the finances are managed. But to say, here's a tax avoidance scheme, which is legal, and then say to a company you can't use it. What's the point? It doesn't make sense.
I'll begin in a second, Francis, but just before I do, could we have a roving mic? There's a gentleman in there who, if you can get the mic to him, and then when Francis has had her answer, we'll come to you, sir. Yes, Francis. Sustainability, is it a way forward?
Well, actually, I want to get back to tax avoidance. I think it was yeah. I think it was Lord Fink who said everybody does it, and it felt as if at the time that PAYE Britain rose as one to say, well, we don't. And it's a reminder that, of course, tax avoidance can be a real cost to the company in terms of reputation and brand, and that maybe that needs to be factored in too. I do think that Simon is right that politicians shouldn't be let off the hook, that, you know, rules have to be tough and they have to be enforced. But we also need to remember that, you know, we are dealing with some very powerful companies who have lots of money to employ lots of accountants to shift money around the world. It's, you know, a complicated business. And so there is a responsibility on companies too. And I say for this reason, because no company operating in the UK could work without taxes being invested, as I see it, in schools and colleges to train and skill and educate people, in our NHS so that workers are healthy and able to work, in our transport system so they can get to work, in our communication system because many of our companies depend on that too. And I think there needs to be a rethink of attitudes towards tax and everybody's responsibility because we do live and work within a society and we all depend on it. We should all contribute to it.
Just before, quick, I mean, you say that Lord Fink's comment and the PAY system goes up. I mean, PAY people have no choice, but an awful lot of them will sort of do a deal for cash to get their car fixed or whatever, which is you know, avoid the VAT. Was actually illegal as opposed to what Fink did, which was technically not illegal. So I think, you know, I'm not taking moral science here, but, you know, if the opportunity presented itself, perhaps a lot of your members might be more willing to cut the corners.
Of course there is a principle, although paying in cash in itself is not tax avoidance, but of course there's a principle, but come on, let's also recognise there's a scale. And I have to say people feel very, very deeply where I come from about big companies avoiding paying millions, sometimes billions, in the taxes they owe.
Well, you have support from the floor on that anyway. The gentleman in the right, can you just identify yourself and then come up with the question, yeah?
Yeah, my name's John Flynn, and it was a question for Simon. Simon, the standard of living that you have is under threat if you actually believe that people can buy the coffee beans from low-tax countries that have got no coffee plantations, and the 26 million people covered by pay-as-you-earn will just turn a blind eye. So what are you going to do to protect your standard of living and the reputation of these major companies that, in the end, people will not do business with?
Look, I take Frances' point where she says reputation and brand is important. And presumably, that was why Starbucks made the measure they did when they gave £20 million that they didn't actually owe to the government. It's an expensive gesture, and you can't run a tax system that way. There are many reasons why, there are many reasons why intellectual property is based in odd places. I don't really understand, let me say in Edinburgh, why Scotch whisky as an intellectual property is based in Holland. I don't think the reasons are the excellence of Dutch whisky production. But the reality is the intellectual property is based in Holland entirely for tax reasons. Now, governments have created patterns of globalized balances between countries, and I'm afraid they have to live with them, or they have to change them. And you can certainly do that, absolutely legitimate, and once the government has changed the law, it has to be obeyed. I'm the first to agree with that. But what I think is important, politicians, it's a dangerous practice to be shifting tax arrangements here to foster that industry and there to foster that industry, because governments aren't very good at that. That's why we have a free market. That's what markets are good at, is allocating resource. And if you decide you're going to favour this particular sector by putting in substantial tax breaks, don't be surprised if people take advantage of it.
So you're comfortable, I mean, you say the law could be changed and companies would obey, but I mean, if you take the United States, I mean, companies with their lobbying power have effectively bought the politicians and get the laws they want.
Well, I don't think we have that situation in this country, and I actually, Tony, that's exaggerated even for the states. Look, companies do have a great deal of power, but ultimately states, including this one and the United States, ultimately have more power. That's why so much American profit is not repatriated to the United States, much as they'd like it to be, because companies have to pay extra tax when they remit those profits to the United States, because it's the government's view that takes precedence in the end. That option is available to politicians in this country too.
I thought that supported my view, actually, rather than the other way around. The fact that the companies are avoiding paying the taxes by keeping the money offshore and using it to...
But that's because of the system that politicians have created, where money is not taxed if it's left outside the country, but it is taxed if it's brought back. I mean, completely daft, it would seem to me.
Do you know what? I really think most of the public, seeing a squabble as to whose fault it is, the public want it fixed. And frankly, I mean, it's fascinating your take on the likes of Starbucks offering, a few quid. Again, for most people, the idea that big companies can negotiate how much tax they pay, the idea that it's seen as a charitable gesture. I think it was Clem Attlee who once said that charity is a cold, loveless thing. If rich people really care about the poor, they should pay their taxes gladly. And I think that's what most ordinary people expect.
On that note, we've only got about 6... let's have the third question. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so let's move on to that. The third question? Yes. This is something completely different. I mean, the issue here is... the pressure for ethical investment from members and so on, and whether you, as in your position close to pension funds, whether you would actually like your members more engaged and with how it's invested, and perhaps demanding that you didn't invest in tobaccos or alcohol or whatever, imposing restraints. How do you feel about that?
Half and half.
That's interesting. Yes, that's it's effectively 50-50. I think the no's have it by an statistically insignificant amount. That's quite interesting. I think there is a specific issue in pensions here, which I'd like to bring out, which again brings us back to profits. That the regulator, a short time ago, said that the security of the pension fund, a company should not be jeopardized by having to bail out the pension fund. Effectively, that by all means contribute to the pension fund, but if it was going to put the company at risk, then the company's profits should come before the members' benefits. That's paraphrasing it. But do you subscribe to that, Francis?
Well, I was just going to share that a couple of years ago in the trade union movement, we set up something called Trade Union Share Owners, where we basically collaborate on our voting using our pension funds and general funds across, actually, I think nearly all of the 350 FTSEs. And we do that in consultation with our membership, and the key issues are top pay, people wanting to see more diversity on boards and for places to be advertised, and also respect for labour standards, the way that the workers are treated. So it's an interesting example of actually using the influence we have in consultation with our members to try and pursue those policies through boards. Of course, our success, if we're honest, is limited because, as we know, I think it's only 20 remuneration reports, top remuneration reports in the last 10 years, maybe 10 years, only 20 have been successful out of thousands. Again, another reason why we need to fix the corporate governance system.
Simon, do you have a view on the pension regulators' guidance? Is it actually a case of putting corporate profits before the pensions?
Look, first of all, let me say, I certainly share the view that it would be great if people did involve themselves far more in members of pension funds. When I was at Reuters, and I know there's a former colleague who can confirm this, I think, 95% of emails that went out, I was a trustee of the pension fund, 95% of emails that went out about the pension fund were deleted unopened. And I just thought that was really depressing, regardless of what it was about, regardless of the age of the people concerned. And I thought that was a terribly depressing fact, and I suspect not unique to that company. Look, at the end of the day, I do think you have to get a balance on these things. I know of at least one case where what would have been a merger in the huge interests of both organisations collapsed completely as soon as the black hole in the pension fund that would be visited on one company became obvious. So I think the balance needs, keeping a company in existence may mean tempering the absolute obligations from historic pension schemes, because actually that was history, and we're in today's world.
It's the last chance to ask a question. Has anybody got a question? Why are you all asking now with 2 minutes to go? I noticed the gentleman, that gentleman at the front and then that one at the back, but very briefly because we are actually up to time.
Yes, can I just take issue with this concept that the PAYE paying public can't or won't make use of tax avoidance schemes. At my last two organisations, I've put in salary sacrifice schemes that have had take-up from something like 99% of the workforce. Those schemes are overtly tax avoidance. They avoid NI payments and they allow people to get income without paying tax. They were put in with the support of our union, who saw it as a major way of increasing the benefits to our employees. That is tax avoidance. You know, that out of 2,000 people, 1,992 took advantage of it.
I'll take that as a comment. Actually, I'll take that as a comment rather than a question, and take the other question from the back.
Average pay, 25,000.
No, can we have the second question from the back?
So it's Anthony Webb from KPMG Investment Advisories. This is a yes-no question, so it should be pretty quick. So given that we haven't mentioned ESG investment at all in this session, does the panel think it's irrelevant in our attempts to create a better society?
Brings us back a bit to sustainability, yes. Yes, no.
The answer is yes, absolutely, because ultimately at the end of the day, and this even gets to the pension question, you need some trust out there. That's where you started, Anthony, was with trust. And you gain trust by doing that kind of investment and seeing the longer term because you have a commitment to ESG focus, yeah.
And last word from you, Simon, and then Francis.
Look, it's a factor. It's an important factor. But ultimately, viability of an organisation is the most important factor.
Francis, last word. I'm not sure this is wise, but the last word from you.
And the question was whether we want to promote it.
Well, whether ESG, basically sustainable investment, environmental stuff, was actually a way of getting this unity of purpose together.
Absolutely, one important way, absolutely important for all of us, particularly the real economy.
Good. Well, I certainly don't want to stand between you and your dinner this evening. We covered a fair amount of ground there. Can I just ask you in the usual way to thank the panel for putting up with me and for their very good answers?